All right, I just started recording.
Okay, I'll start recording soon.
All right, welcome everybody. Glad to see people. We've heard some of this, but just to announce and tell you a little bit about what Platypus is. Platypus is an organization that has been around since December 2006. We organize reading groups, public fora, research and journalism, focus on the problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s, the new left of the 1960s and 70s, and the post-political left of the 80s and 90s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. At Boston College, we have a reading group on Monday nights, 7 to 9:30. And we have the sign-up sheet here if you want to get in touch with us about that. And then on Wednesdays, we're kind of changing it up, but right now it's 1:30 to 2:30 on Wednesdays. We have coffee breaks where we just kind of informally talk about what's going on, distribute our Platypus review. So you can get in touch with us there. And then at UNH, you might have said it, but if you want to reiterate.
On Thursdays, we have a reading group from 6 to 8:30, and then we have a baked pizza night on Mondays from 6 to 8.
Cool. So I guess the only other thing I'll say is we were trying to hold a panel for this event, trying to get different voices from the left to curate a discussion around the issue of Israel-Palestine. People didn't accept. And so this is kind of the second best thing we can do is hold this teach-in, but just to say that obviously it's a different nature than a panel. So I don't know exactly what Luke will bequeath us with, but there will be, I imagine, some kind of argument, some kind of perspective, and I encourage much discussion, disagreement in the ensuing Q&A. Keep it civil, we're all comrades, and leave the Luke.
Thank you. I don't really have any opening remarks other than this rather hastily put together presentation. So I'll dive right in, but I will kind of go through a little fast. There are around 30 slides, and I'm trying to keep these kind of framing remarks to about 30 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A then. If you really have a burning question, feel free to call it out. Okay, so we'll start with the original panel prompt, which it was to frame a panel on the politics of solidarity. So I've kind of kept the topic, but we'll be approaching it through the lens of a few older Platypus engagements with what we call the dead left, which is really just the people who consider themselves leftists today. And we consider ourselves part of this quote unquote dead left. So the approach is kind of a self-symptomatic one, seeing ourselves as symptoms of the failure of the left to basically effect the revolution or, to carry out its originary goals. So anyway, the original prompt had 2 Edward Said quotes, which, as you note, span about 20 years. So since these are short, I'll read them, but later on there will be a couple longer passages that I'll ask 1 or 2 of you guys to help me read. So this one, the first one from 1983 says, "The history of thought, to say nothing of political movements, is extravagantly illustrative of how the dictum, solidarity before criticism, means the end of criticism. I take criticism so seriously as to believe that, even in the midst of battle, in which one is unmistakably on one side against the other, there should be criticism, because there must be critical consciousness if there are to be issues, problems, values, even lives to be fought for." So that's from secular criticism. And then in 2003, he wrote on dignity and solidarity, "The Palestinian struggle for justice is especially something with which one must express solidarity, rather than endless criticism and exasperated, frustrating discouragement, or crippling divisiveness. Remember the solidarity here and everywhere." So you can kind of see change, development, regression in these remarks, potentially impacted by different changed historical circumstances. There's a bit more to the prompt though. Since the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 and the New Left anti-Vietnam War movement, one word has characterized the left's relationship to Israel-Palestine more than any other: solidarity. Since then, there have been major changes in political organization and political consciousness, both in the region and beyond, yet the concept of solidarity has remained. Perhaps this consistency is misleading. Misleading in that perhaps there have been changes since the Vietnam War until now, yet is the concept unchanged? Can we really apply the same politics of that period and before to current problems? And so I kind of expanded this question to ask, solidarity on what grounds? This is a fill in the blank game. Solidarity with Palestine or the Palestinians as, and then the things below in column 1, on the grounds of, and then you can fill in things on, this isn't a match game, they are aligned. Although I would appreciate it if anyone has another kind of formulation that they'd like to add. Yeah,
Okay, well, we argue a lot on how much this could fall into what category, but you could sympathize with them on the grounds of bourgeois agreement, because a good deal of the refugees of Palestine have actual like tax records, property documents showing that they did in fact own property within the pre-47 borders, and therefore they're merely property holders been dispossessed by an alien entity.
okay, fair enough.
It's an old reading. I've heard some people proffer the argument, so it's just,
No, I totally accept it. I didn't include things of such a granular nature because there could be all types of violations of the civil rights of Palestinians that could be kind of grouped under. I think it's not a bad characterization of like, solidarity with Palestine as those who's had their civil rights taken away. And that could be on the grounds of liberalism, on bourgeois society.
I
Property
take
law.
issue with the idea of solidarity with Palestine as a Muslim on the grounds of anti-Zionism.
I was a little worried about that one too. What's your particular
Well, despite like Islam is the answer types of movements and using that becoming kind of part of anti-colonial discourse. I mean, the Palestinians are not all Muslim, and Zionists don't discriminate. Actually.
So maybe this on the grounds of is the incorrect part, but I do feel that there is, at least in the United States, like a particular sort of maybe liberal angst that sees Muslims as a particularly, especially after the war on terror, that sees Muslims as a particularly downtrodden or oppressed group.
For the record, I think that's right. I mean, really, Palestinians, Pakistani Muslims especially are taught like this is their issue. And so Muslims do. So definitely, there's definitely Muslims that are in solidarity with Palestine because they're Muslim. I'm just not sure that Zionism is the.
Yeah, I agree. That might not.
I don't know what it.
Because Zionism is also a word
The
that
Muslim part is
I
right.
to combine.
What the grounds is.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Ty.
off the top of my head. If you're referring to other Muslims, maybe solidarity with Dar al-Islam, or the what's it called? What's that term for like the broader
Ummah.
yeah, the broader Ummah. Yeah, that was well,
But it's the anti-Zionism. It's not. I don't know.
I mean you
On
could
the grounds of racism? I don't know.
or maybe,
Yeah.
maybe compare it with Buddhism, given that that was a Jewish movement that did not particularly like the idea of Zionism. It's not broadly assimilate into modern society.
Points appreciated. Let's not get too caught up on the anti-Zionism. I realize that might have been a misstep.
I think that maybe you could see it as like, if you're looking for like a positive anti-Zionism, maybe like pan-Arabism. I think that was in a lot of ways historically a reaction to like Israel in history.
Okay. Yeah. I thought some of I guess what we're trying to trace here is a regression in history that doesn't have like very clear boundaries because these terms are shifting in their meanings and their political tractability Their kind of, I guess I meant their tractability in the historical circumstance varies, and therefore their kind of applicability from the historical perspective of the left varies along with it. I don't know if that sentence made sense, but an example would be starting at the bottom. You could see all national liberation struggles as forms of imperialism, but from a very particular perspective of the failure of the left, such as, for example, why do we see these struggles as, why do we see national liberation struggles as part of the left? Why do we see victims of imperialism in kind of a liberal, taking a liberal way as victims of imperialism? When there was previously like a much deeper consciousness of, maybe you could have seen victims of imperialism as tasking world revolution or tasking the need to reestablish a socialist party independent of the state. You could have seen the very concept of imperialism as, the highest stage of capitalism, or merely as continuation of the task that socialists and Marxists had taken up historically. And isn't it kind of a falling beneath that to see Palestine or Palestinians through these other lenses? I don't mean that these are inappropriate. I have sympathy for even, the kind of most basic, we just need ceasefire as a humanitarian aim. I'm very sympathetic to that because I don't know if there's possibility for anything else. But we do have to recognize that it doesn't seem like there's possibility for anything else. And I think we should see our acceptance of solidarity with Palestinians, for example, on humanitarian grounds as, a defeat, as a symbol of how far we've fallen below a potential political horizon. But I've left this up on the screen for a little while. Did anyone have a comment about any of the other solidarity with Palestine as blank on the grounds of blank? Any of the pairings? Part of where I got the idea of falling below a horizon is from Platypus's own engagements on this topic in the past. So we've had several panels, discussions, interviews, and articles in the Platypus Review, which I've laid out here. And the regression, I don't know if this fits like a Frankfurt School definition of regression, but you can see even within the 16 years that Platypus has been around, it seems, some type of regression in how people discuss this issue. For example, this panel in 2021, it featured people still talking about one state and two state solutions. It featured people asking, did the Communist Party, did the Comintern demand that all of the other national communist parties kind of support Israel? Like, this was a live issue in this debate only 2 years ago, whereas now you hardly hear people mention communism in the same breath as the Israel-Palestine conflict. In 2015, we did an interview with Moshe Machleberg, I can't pronounce names. But he's an interesting example of a figure in whom you can also see this regression. So he was one of the panelists here in the top left. And in 2015, he had a lot more to say about his roots, what's the party called? As one of the founding members of the Israeli Social Organization. I'll kind of these are just kind of an advertisement for Platypus's backlog on Israel-Palestine. In 2011, we had a roundtable discussion between Richard Rubin, one of the founding members of Platypus, and Alan Goodman, who is a kind of Maoist member of the revolutionary not Chinese Communist Party. That flows off the tongue so well. Of the Revolutionary Communist Party. I'll just whiz through a couple more of these. This panel was called "Which Way Forward for Palestinian Liberation?" And as you can see from the book titles, this was very clearly about what type of political solution is possible or necessary in 2010. And very early on, there were these two, in 2008, these two engagements with the left, tracing all the way back to Platypus Review number 5, collector's item. And I don't know if I can zoom in. Like great titles for articles here. Catastrophe, Historical Memory in the Left, 60 Years of Israel-Palestine. Well, now we're at 75 years, right? We still have catastrophe, but do we have the historical memory? So at UNH, I was initially a little bit worried about bringing up Israel-Palestine as an open discussion topic, given that we would be inviting anyone on campus or off. And I didn't want the conversation to be this kind of, which side are you on? Or, emotionally heated. And so we read these 3 articles, which I've provided selections of, to kind of give a framing device, but also to deflate people's passionate side taking, rather to give them a perspective of, well, what would the historical left think of us, right? If they were judging us, don't we all kind of stand to be judged rather than us, criticizing whoever has a slightly different opinion on side taking? So would anyone be so kind as to read one or more of these paragraphs out loud? Noah, thank you.
Anti-imperialism is the rock on which the left was to shatter in the decades after World War II. Seduced by the romance of the age of decolonization, the left liquidated itself in the sense that it came to unlearn what had once been clear. Colonies were a symptom of the crisis of capitalism and the attempts of the Bonapartist state to manage that crisis. After analytically separating the colonies that were founded in the age of the bourgeois revolution, which Karl Kautsky concluded were based on work, from the exploitative and extractive colonies that were formed after the rise of industrial capitalism, Kautsky reiterated that the only tenable colonial policy for socialists was one of revolution. Before the Great War, Lenin, Kautsky, and Luxemburg understood themselves to be allies in upholding orthodoxy, as they tried to understand the race for colonies as a symptom of the ever deeper crisis of capitalism that had taken shape as a result of the class struggles since 1848.
These paragraphs might not flow. I should have indicated more clearly that they're non-sequential. It's just to get a quick taste. It's all Will's fault. He was very authoritarian, demanding that I keep this short.
I said an hour, it doesn't have to be 30 minutes.
Well, still Will's fault. Would someone else read this one, please? Any other ones here? Yeah.
The left has abdicated the possibility for a responsible politics with progressive social transformation and emancipation. Instead, a contrarian mood prevails in which U.S. policy and its relationship with the social and political realities with which it grapples are opportunistically vilified. It seems enough to say that the U.S. is imperialist power and to derive politics from its
Hypostasized
characterization. In doing so, the left seeks to avoid its own convenient history. We in Platypus recognize that leftist politics today is characterized by such deep despair. No one on the left seems to actually believe in the possibility for a transformed and emancipated world. Whatever vision does exist is of a nature much too derived from wounded narcissism and animated by the kind of loathing expressed by Susan Sontag in 1957 to the effect that the white race is the cancer of human history. As such, the desire for change has become utterly reactionary. In its reactionary character, the left has devolved into apologetics for the world as it is, for existing social and political movements that have nothing in common with social emancipation. The left has largely already become
Thank you. I guess we could pause just for any question about what individual sentences or phrases mean. We can have more general discussion about it afterward. But are there any sentences or formulations that seem unclear or unwarranted?
Oh, that were hypostat.
Yeah, I Googled that.
Hypothesized.
Yeah.
An underlying reality of the substance as opposed to attributes or to that of the black substance.
It's the broader category, which reification is a subtype, so it's the process, it's the phenomenon of describing a process as a thing, is one way of, as an abstraction. So like commodity fetishism by Marx and talking about reification, Lukács and others is a way of, is a particular form of hypothesization of the social reproduction of capitalism, reducing it to a thing or eliminating the process and the agency of its various actors, etc. So I think in this case, it's the kind of thingification or staticization of something that actually has a history and a dynamism to it.
So specifically, there's a claim that imperialism as a category has this kind of dynamic quality where it tasks the imperial nation, the members of it in the metropole, it tasks them to form well, later in Marxism, a party, a socialist party, in order to take up the political task of revolution, not on their own, but as, you know, on an international basis, taking responsibility for the entire imperialist entity. And that kind of degraded to just become, oh, this is a, you know, the metropole exploits, or the citizens who live in the metropole benefit from this newly defined imperialistic relationship, which simply meant exploitation or oppression or domination. So I guess that's the sense in which the category of imperialism became more static, less dynamic, lost its kind of historical task.
I guess just to piggyback on that real quick, I would say hypothesize, so making it static, but there's also, I think, a moralization and a kind of demonization that's perhaps implied there as well, that insofar as you're tracing this regression, it seems to me that it's suggesting that this quote by Krispy Kreme that for the left, imperialism is just bad, it's just a bad thing that one is to be against. And so that, I think that's what you're getting at with, that is very different than this older perspective of Marxism, where, as you put it, it's a task, and more importantly, it's a specific phenomenon that's inherent to capitalism at a certain stage of development that actually specifies how the social revolution will happen, and that precisely having a revolution in a capitalist core country would be the way to make a revolution in a way that revolutions in peripheral colonized nations wouldn't have the same objective effect.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think I sort of get what's being said here in the first paragraph, and what Bill was talking about is that, you know, in Marx's time and Rosa Luxemburg's time and stuff like that, there was a feeling of motion and progress, and that's something that can be steered in a direction, you know. And then over here, it's, you know, something just kind of static opposition to a force that doesn't seem like it can be moved or something like that. And I just wonder, I'm looking at this part of like opportunistically vilified, and I'm just kind of wondering, like, what is being, how is it, it's opportunistic, if it's being said opportunistic, like what are people that are thinking this way getting out of it? Like, what is the opportunity towards, you know?
Yeah, it's not so much towards an opportunity, it's opportunistic in the sense that it's like a tactic. I think the argument here is that it's based on a psychological wound, right? Where this wound is taken to be the failure of the revolution. And there's like some type of psychological, I don't know if it's a benefit or release or from hiding from it, right? There's a relief, I guess you could say, from avoiding that wound. And one way to avoid it is to just simplify things into categories that can be denounced or groups that can be denounced, like the example here of the white race being a cancer of human history.
Okay, that makes sense. Sort of almost echoes the USSR turn away from the West and towards Asia after the German Revolution failed. Kind of seemed like a thing you could influence, so towards it.
Yeah, especially in that it turned the USSR or Stalinized Marxism or whatever, turned away from bourgeois society as its root and kind of
Yeah.
being the origin of its task. And so, yeah, capitalism and the bourgeoisie become purely negative rather than critical categories. Yeah, let's move on. This is a huge slider, so you guys mind keeping going with the reading? Is there a new volunteer for this one page? Yeah, thanks.
The anti-imperialist left considers itself opposed to all U.S. government action as imperialist on principle, but as Trotsky wrote to his followers in 1938, learn to think. While one may oppose the government politically, to oppose the government putting out fire, especially when there is no alternative agency, is nonsense. But the left today is not the inheritor of Trotsky, but rather what he politically assailed, the policy of the Stalinist Popular Front against foreign fascism of the 1930s, for which the shibboleth was, which side are you on? The idea that the defeat of imperialist policy creates possibility for an alternative, and therefore one must always be against imperialism to be on the side of an alternative to it. Historically, Marxists have understood such a strategy in terms of either revolutionary defeatism or revolutionary defensism. Simply put, the defeat of an imperialist power is seen as providing the possibility for a political alternative to the government of the imperialist country, whereas the defense of the country against imperialist attack is seen as providing the possibility for a political alternative in the subaltern country. Importantly, these are not pacifist positions against war, but rather political military strategies in time of war. Moreover, with the aim of revolution.
Let's just do this last slide. These are a little bit non-sequential, so we have one more reader. Yeah, thanks.
Anti-imperialism today is not revolutionary, but rather counter-revolutionary, that is, the species of the most powerful actually constitute counter-revolutionary political force, nationalism. Defeatism and defensism today have no progressive emancipatory political and social power either, for they are not revolutionary in any sense beyond perhaps the conventional and superficial ones of regime change. Today's left agrees with the imperialists in their horizon of politics, the existing international system of national states. The left today may be divided among and within the nation states, between those who side with this or that government policy, but they are all on the same side of commenting global capitalism, imperialism. There is no real anti-imperialism, but only various forms of compromise with imperialism, which is regarded pejoratively as merely this or that governmental policy, but is accepted at a deeper level as an unshakable reality. However, historical Marxists once knew that it will not be possible to move beyond it on this basis.
Yeah, thank you. Similarly, let's linger on this last Internationalism Fails essay by Christopher in 2013. Mostly for parts that seem to not make sense, or you want to state your own clarifications.
I would say like this thing actually connected to the last page that we see that it's about that the lab is losing this possibility of imagine what is utopia, imagine how to really move on. And we see that usually in today's dialogue, in today's conversation, when people are anti-imperialists, they are not anti-imperialists just from the perspective of a socialist revolution or making a revolution, but instead they are they're using anti-imperialism just as a tool to create nationalism and as a tool to actually even in some ways like building a new imperialism.
Yeah, so this is a different use than Alex was talking about, a different type of opportunism. Whereas one was categorized as avoiding a wound. This is really like a geopolitical or, political tool, but not politics as conceived of by the historical left of Marxism, the politics of the right.
So in more general, I think like the idea of like the internationalism is losing its, like people stop to, in general, like at this, I think in all around the world, you start to believe that we can actually have this internationalism. And I think it is surprised to see that, because this is actually happens with the same time that the globalization from pushed by the liberalism. We can see that, well, there's like globalism, which is sort of like the internationalism version, like the liberalism or capitalist version of internationalism, but like just without the solidarity of the proletariat, they have the solidarity of capitalists. And we see that the internationalism itself is actually losing its supporter in this, under this context of globalization, which is kind of surprising, because I thought like if we have more globalization, well, it sounds really liberal, but if we have more globalization, that would mean that capitalism has developed to the stage that we have global, like, well, it's sort of like Kautsky, but I don't agree with Kautsky, but I was using this term of global financial capitalists that actually is oppressing all the proletariat in the global together. And in this stage, that by logic, I think there should be more internationalism, but now I'm seeing that under the globalization, we actually see the failure of internationalism.
Yeah, I mean, you could always say, not just now, but you could say since Adam Smith, that there was like a material condition of cooperation, right? If the industrial forces of production also include, how people cooperate as producers, well, the division of labor has already spread globally in Adam Smith's time, or at least the task for it to exist. And that's been true up until now, right? Both in how things are produced and how we relate to each other outside of our ideology. I think what's definitely changed is, this social consciousness or people's ideology. And liberalism was once tied to an ideology that embraced internationalism and saw potential in it. Whereas now, there's been a degradation of that, or a shift in capitalism such that, it's required to change an ideology. And so there's a line I left out of the snippets from this article, which talked about the difference between internationalism and inter-nationalism. Whereas now, even when, let's just say liberals, but really everybody tries to find like the promise, to rediscover the promise of internationalism, they're really just thinking about how individual nations can work together peacefully. And that's a lowered horizon.
I would say like they're thinking individual state instead of just nation.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that, like, in terms of internationalism, what is the state? What is the international state perceived if you're thinking along those lines? I feel like that's sort of part of what the turn away from internationalism has to do with is, on the one hand, it makes sense. You have globalization, you have a more and more kind of international community where it seems like, it seems easier to have solidarity towards workers in other countries and stuff. And that sort of makes it seem like a better condition for revolution, because less you can't do it's harder to blame it other, although I guess we're seeing right now that that's not the case at all. But then, maybe there's a turn away from it in terms of like a feeling of power. I don't know, like the more international it becomes, like the more hopeless it almost kind of thing. Because it's really not international. It's really like American hegemony. Maybe there's a distinction to that we made.
Yeah, well, let me just be like a socialist and say that the purpose of the state, from a socialist Marxist perspective is really just to preserve this kind of dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and maintain the status quo. And that's the purpose of having all of these nation states, which are so small and have, their own nationalisms mobilized against each other, or at least that's a resource that's always available. Okay, that's kind of like an obvious point, but I mean, isn't it more provocative to have, people living in a metropole of a modern empire, right, before World War I, where they could, have this gigantic swath of land that encompasses what are now many different nations? And wouldn't the revolution then be easier? Like, doesn't it seem closer to having one unified, universal state that kind of allows us, from a Marxist perspective, to get at these contradictions of capitalism? That seems easier from an empire, living in an empire. It seems much harder, and maybe that's the point of living in this world where we have to talk in terms of individual nationalities and their various relations of oppression or geopolitical interests. And relations of their people to them, right? Those are all different as well. Okay, we can come back to that all later. The next section, I'm having trouble telling the time. I guess we're about half an hour in, right? Or a little more, 40 minutes. Something like that.
40 minutes. 40 minutes.
I have about 10 or 15 of these, what is the left saying now? But I hope you guys will work with me, because a big obstacle I've found in discussing this issue is that people get into debates about what the media really said. Right? Was that actually the headline? Does whatever group, like, to what extent is the Democratic Party pro or anti funding Israel? Is that because they're genocidal? Is that because they want, a quick resolution to some aspect of this conflict? Is it because they're also part of this apartheid state or whatever? And so I gathered these, some of them are YouTube video titles. Most of them are headlines from news stories from, I think, recognizable leftist sources. But the really subjective part that I hope you guys won't argue with me too much is the selection of the statement. So I kind of chose what I thought was most interesting and what applied most to this solidarity with Palestine on grounds of. So I tried to find that in these articles, but there is more. And it's admittedly a little bit of like a provocative conversation starter rather than the final word about any of these organizations. Also, you will find that I didn't include any like really mainstream news or, I only included things, statements from people who consider themselves leftists. So the first one is from Moshe Makover. Again, this is his 2023 statement, where he stated, most people are not politically educated or enlightened to understand the causality of this, which is the Israeli occupation that's the root. So it's hard to find a statement from this long interview.
Just to specify, this is after October 7th.
After October 7th. These are all after October 7th.
Okay.
Unless explicitly stated at the end. And so here, the point of this like 2-hour hemming and hawing interview that he gave was really that he's embracing the politics of resistance. He's saying, this man knows a lot about the backstory. He was politically involved, for the last 50 years. And he's kind of just settled on all we can do is have this kind of vague support for the Palestinians, which, unfortunately, as he would say, will include support for Hamas, being forced to act in some type of resistance sort of way. And so I included this because his face and name came up earlier. So I put it first to show a regression from his, he used to, in like 1973, I read a good interview from him where he was like, had a very nuanced position of how we should see settlers as, kind of the most oppressed workers rather than the most aggressive, like imperialists. How you could see them either way, right? And so he was just trying to problematize solidarity with either side. Anyway, it's kind of a regression to a very clear, well, I mean, the politics of resistance are not clear, but at least it can clearly fit into that category. The other ones will be more accessible. I just had to include that one first. Do you guys like reading things out loud, or should I read it pretty easily? But this is from the Black Agenda Report, which is a podcast that I've listened to a lot. I kind of don't know how to characterize their political tendency in a non-derogatory way, but I guess it would be like, I think they would see themselves as Marxist-Leninists. So the headline was, "The demand for a ceasefire is necessary but not sufficient. The demand must be for decolonization and Palestinian self-determination." So that's solidarity on certain grounds, but also it's not exactly calling for a stop to military conflict, which is interesting. So I found this one striking because I don't know if this is a term to be talking about off the books. Maybe I can go through them quickly, and then we can kind of, you guys will read faster than I speak, and we can come back to one Steve.
I have a question about like
Yeah.
what's planned here. Is there going to be a specific time where we're talking directly about the cause of that regression that you've referred to a few times now?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. It seemed like something you were going to get into later. So.
I was hoping that it would be a framing for the Q&A discussion, which I hope will not be questions towards me and answers from me,
Okay.
but will be between all of us.
Yeah.
So definitely hold on to that for 1 minute.
Yeah.
And I'll just go through the first 5 of these so we don't spend forever. So the next one, there were some DSA defectors, a group of 24 longtime members of the DSA. I thought Confident would be here, I'm surprised he's not. He was one of them who signed this letter saying that we're leaving the DSA because there was too much ambiguity in the DSA leadership's statements about support for essentially the October 7th style Hamas reaction to oppression. Norman Finkelstein has been a speaker at many Platypus events in the last couple of years. He considers himself like a Maoist or an ex-Maoist who is now critical of the Maoism that he practiced politically. And the YouTube title is, "Can we compare what Hamas did on October 7th to Nat Turner's slave revolt and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising?" His answer is yes. Maybe we can help with this. This is supposed to be just a gloss. So Jacobin magazine had the headline, "The growing pro-Palestine protests are becoming a mass movement," and they compare it favorably, saying that these are even bigger than the anti-war movement around the invasion of Iraq. So kind of a positive, things are happening on the left. A group called Solidarity with Migrants said their headline was "An urgent call from Palestinian trade unions." So they saw the Palestinians as workers. They wanted to be in solidarity with Palestinians as workers, even though, at least in the Gaza Strip, there has been, a decrease in the kind of labor interactions between Israel and Gaza, if we can use those terms, where there's a lot less crossing the border to do jobs that were done recently. You may have seen the revitalization of the BDS social media campaign. I don't know if you've seen this at your schools, and I can never remember what BDS stands for. Boycott, divest, and sanction. Thank you. So this is kind of an old political strategy being revitalized. And you'll notice that the 3 they're targeting are Starbucks, McDonald's, and Disney. I'll leave for you to comment. The party, the PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation, I think is what it stands for. Their headlines, instead of giving a statement, I just put their most recent 5 headlines about this issue. "Free Palestine, free all Palestinian political prisoners, and all US aid to the Israeli apartheid regime. Why Washington is responsible for every death in Gaza." Blah, blah, blah. The SWP USA, Social Workers Party USA, headline says, SWP tells truth about Hamas war on Jews, builds US labor struggles. Different perspective. Or, you know.
What are these guys?
What are they?
Are they?
They're like they're in the Trotskyist tradition, and they split from the UK SWP. What are the big names associated with them?
What?
Is this Brown?
With SWP?
No, Shackman. Yeah, I forget.
Abstractly?
I should know that. Cannon is definitely a figure. Thank you. Ignore everything I said. I forget. But the SWP UK had kind of a different headline, which said, "Beware the double meaning of ceasefire in Palestine." They were saying, like, it's a way to disarm you. Instead, perhaps the fighting should continue. These are kind of fun, right? We just do a couple more. So, the socialist alternative, SALT, says, "Stop the war on Gaza." Let me just read one of these. It is the combination of Israeli oppression. Oh, this one had like kind of a Marxist tinge to it. So see if you think it applies in the present. It is the combination of Israeli oppression, Hamas's opposition to the PLO, and the latter's disastrous sellout policies during the Oslo Accords that positioned Hamas to weaken and supplant the more historically left-wing elements of the Palestinian resistance. Marxists assert the right of the oppressed masses to struggle, including armed struggle, in defense against endless brutality and military occupation, backed by elected committees of struggle in the Palestinian communities. This was exemplified by the tactics of the mass Palestinian uprising of 1987 and the dignity strike of 2021. The call for a mass struggle in the region is not utopian. Reaching for something. Let's see how many. So I have 5 more of them. Let's just finish them off. So Rashida Tlaib censure is an attack on the entire movement in Palestine, says Left Voice. Admittedly, I didn't do very much research into this, but it has left in the title. But I was interested in the association that actually several of these organizations had with the Democrats, especially the Squad, attacks on them being particularly damaging to the Palestinian movement. And I saw that as an interesting connection, reliance on the state, maybe. Bernie Sanders, of course, has come out, headline has come out in favor of Israel, is what I meant. The headline was, "Bernie Sanders rejects progressives' call for ceasefire in Israeli conflict. Hamas has got to go." And then this was kind of for context for what Norman Finkelstein said over a decade ago. This was the headline is "Peace or Palestinian Surrender," an interview with Norm Finkelstein. But would anyone else find?
I'll do it.
Yes.
Because there's no leadership or mass struggle right now in Palestine. Any Tom, Dick, or Harry can step into the breach and claim to represent Palestinian civil society. Western leftists and liberals are prone to being guilt-tripped by people of color playing the race card, who claim to be the vanguard of the revolution. If you dissent, you're then labeled as a white Jewish liberal colonial imperialist, Zionist, whatever. I remember this sort of Mao-ing, as Tom Wolfe memorably dubbed it. From the days of the Black Panthers, and I admit to having fallen into the trap back then. But I'm now way too old for these silly sectarian cultist politics. My guess is, if and when the Palestinian struggle reemerges, it will set plausible goals, and all the one-state talk will vanish like snow on a spring afternoon.
This is the same guy we just saw earlier saying, "This is Nat Turner. This is."
It's a term that was used by Tom Wolfe in a essay, I believe called like the Black Catchers or something, talking about how a few sort of left-wing editorialists and other cultural commentators came to the defense of the Black Panthers. The term Mau Mau from the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. So the way Tom Wolfe was using it was saying, "Oh, hey, look at how these white liberals are defending this struggle of minorities and trying to like project an anti-colonial struggle upon them." So that's, if my recollection serves.
Yeah. in this context, it's used to be like making a threat, like a political threat, as in, if you think this, you are someone who holds that position.
That's it.
Yeah. And then, I guess I already described motion offers older positions, so we don't have to think that. And that was all. I don't know, I left someone else's name. Never signed your own name. Yeah, maybe. Anyway, now I'd like to open up for discussion, and I don't think we need a break yet, but you're welcome to come up and grab water or some snacks if you like. I think we can just leave it totally up to you. I'm happy to go back to earlier slides if that helps. But what comments or questions, not only to me, but to anyone else here, has this inspired?
I wanted to add something about Hamas.
Yeah,
It's just,
Hamas at this moment in history is not, there have been so many, this discussion among the Palestinians, what's the best form of negotiate versus violent resistance, negotiate versus violent resistance, and that's ongoing for a long time. And Hamas starts out kind of in this, on the violent end of anti-colonial resistance. There's just one problem right now, which has been a problem for a while. Hamas is not, it's funded by Iran. And Iran is not interested in the liberation of Palestinians. Iran is not interested in the liberation of anyone. And I don't know what their motives are. You can't.
Palestine, I mean, Hamas doesn't seem to be interested in the liberation of Palestinians.
And like viewing, I don't know, like, how are we, I don't know how to do that, except with great precision.
I'll play the role of moderator, just point out
Yeah,
how there is.
yeah. I think a big issue with the media is that it kind of, it's like hard to like, figure out like the particular statement, the nature of Hamas that you kind of brought up. Since technically, like some historians argue that Hamas started off as sort of a non-violent charitable organization that gave out healthcare that slowly became more militant and violent. Some have pointed to Israel deliberately promoting them and propping them up throughout a few decades, specifically to undermine Yasser Arafat, and subsequently under the Likud government to prop them up to divvy up Gaza and the West Bank from having a unity government. And then, now post, the 06 election, which Hamas got into power, the media is not useful in like separating the factions within it, where there are more moderate elements that have altered some of the rhetoric. But then there are instances where these guys are like being assassinated by Israel as they moderate. And then the media itself is making unclear at some intervals of who started this violence. I believe in one instance, the IDF wasn't some special raid that killed a member of Palestinian Jihad in the West Bank, and then that caused a retaliatory rocket strike from Gaza. And it completely left out those details from like archived articles.
All right, can I have one request for this conversation?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That we don't talk about ambiguities in media statements.
Yeah. I know.
Because this is like the most frustrating
I'm
thing.
sorry.
is
Sorry.
Even if you get down to the bottom of it, it's like, so what?
Right. I'm just saying, like, it takes like a while to get to the root cause of any of this stuff.
That I think we can all agree on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, apologies on my
No,
part.
no worries.
Yeah.
so I showed up a little late, so sorry if this question's already been asked, but kind of going off the previous points. I feel like the Palestinians have kind of been used as like a political tool by like some members of like the Arab world, like for example, like Egypt, Jordan, or Iran, who we've been mentioning, who.
Yeah, Iran is an Arab, just sorry.
No, sorry, they're
Yes,
Farsi, my bad. But like, but it's like
Just beyond me, but.
that. No, great correction. But like a lot of the Middle Eastern world, like they're pro-Palestine. Like I think we can agree, like that's the state that's what they kind of agree with. But like from what we've seen through action, it's like Egypt isn't really accepting Palestinian refugees, neither is Iran, from what I know, and neither are a lot of the other states that are currently supporting the Palestinian struggle. So I'm wondering, like, how much of this is like a political struggle versus like how much of this is actually like a concern of human rights, because as we know, like the region is not necessarily famous for their adherence to human rights.
So I put the question like this, and I'll call you this next Alex. Just that there doesn't seem to be even a clear geopolitical win possible on the table for anybody.
Exactly.
And so we're kind of stuck just seeing this as a humanitarian disaster And how do you react to a humanitarian disaster in a political way? Like from a Marxist historical perspective.
I was just gonna say that I think that this is kind of a misconception that like the Sisi regime or like the Hashemite kingdom or bin Salman for that matter are like pro-Palestinian in any meaningful sense. Like those governments, the governments that border Palestine, even the Lebanese government, that is opposed to Hezbollah, like like the Sisi regime definitely does not support Palestine. I think that this is I just think that's a mischaracterization. I don't think it makes sense. Because there's the Sisi regime has done nothing to like support Palestinians.
I think they have to act like they are supportive.
Yeah, sure. They like maybe kind of appropriate the aesthetic. Like there have been like Sisi has like permitted certain protests that are like sponsored by his government in an interesting way. But I don't think that is to say that they're like pro-Palestinian.
I would just say there's a difference between the countries that actually share borders with Israel versus the ones that don't. And you were absolutely right. Egypt they're protecting their own interests. They're not, I know I spent a lot of time in Egypt and so there's I think what everyone calls the 1967 war from the Arab world perspective was just a huge land grab where Israel didn't just steal the land that Britain told them they could steal. They just started stealing land from sovereign nation states that pre-existed them. And specifically, Egypt fought a very bloody war in 1973 to get their land back from Israel, and that land is the Sinai. So as soon as the way Israel responded in Gaza, as far as Egypt was concerned, this was a land grab. And they were going to get Gaza, and where are they coming for next? They're coming for the Sinai. And they're not even thinking about the Palestinians. They're thinking about, and Sisi totally, it's just about him surviving because Egyptians have been putting up with so much from him. But, there's really, 1973 isn't that long ago. There's still people alive that lost people in that war,
I have another quick intervention because we can't have this discussion just be about like the facts and people like speculating about the motivations of various geopolitical positions.
Point out the bordering states are a little bit different. They have different concerns that are definitely nation state concerns for their own nations versus, what Saudi Arabia is doing. Saudi Arabia doesn't have a border with them and their motivations are different. That was my only point.
So if you do want to make these points, can you just make them in service of a point about like how the left is reacting or this question that Alex raised about historical regression?
The through line I'm saying there is not exactly related to folks like, what's happened to the Palestinian movement since the 70s, right? Like, it wasn't at any point more kind of, was there a point where these states weren't just cynically using them as sort of a tool, I guess, I don't know what to call it, like, cudgel basically, for their own interests. Like, the regression sort of seems to parallel the regression we were talking about before with the left.
Yes, what are the strong cases? Like, why was the international, communist movement interested in Israel as a state? Why were they originally interested in Palestine as a potential project? Yeah.
I don't know if this applies to like a diatribe territory, but from the books I've read, I believe Stalin was the first to recognize Israel in 1948 before the United States, and the U.S. was more recalcitrant in recognizing Israel since the sort of ruling clique of Ben Gurion and company were Eastern European socialist Jews who were writing telegrams off to Stalin, and so on paper it was not in America's interest at that time to form a relationship with Israel since it would alienate a video of the Arab world. And even if you look even decades later, the U.S. always has been reluctant to back Israel's more aggressive foreign policy maneuvers.
Could I follow up on the first part of your statement? What interest do you think Stalin or the Soviet Union had in Israel, aside from geopolitical maneuvers?
Right. Ideologically, all these settlers were Eastern European Jews who wanted to work in kibbutzim, which were these cooperative economic communities. They also had, I forget the Hebrew word, but this is like one big trade union that, you know, kind of controlled the economy for decades on end.
I'm
So,
blanking on the name too.
right, but yeah, that's Jerry, it's escaping my brain at the moment, but yeah, there's a lot of elements that were in keeping with the socialism and the left broadly. I think most recently, I think the Labor Party of Israel as the side of the two. It was still for like, I believe the Socialist International network of, leftist parties, and only left, I think a few years ago when it formally endorsed BDS as, as a, international stance to take against Israel, largely because of the rightward shift there.
Yeah.
It's not good.
He said, oh, okay, he's gonna do, he's, which was like a big, union that controlled Israel economy.
Wait, sorry, what was it called?
His dread root, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
HISTADRD.
Okay.
Yes.
I wanted to talk about a point you made in your presentation that's kind of a different topic, so sorry to change topic, but you said something I found really interesting about like internationalism versus internationalism, right? And how it might be easier to have revolution in a empire, right? But maybe it is the breaking up of the nation states and this kind of new nationalism that has been a regression, right? And I think that makes sense. And I also think to a similar point that like the greater Pan-Arab project also kind of does something to counteract that, in that it might be easier to have revolution in an Arab state, right? And I think that the Palestinian cause is definitely something that unites that Arab state, that Pan-Arab tendency. And I think that could be understood as progressive if we understand an empire as something that kind of has the conditions for revolution. So I guess I'm just kind of curious maybe what your thoughts on that are, Luke, or what other people think about this idea of like having one big state be easier for revolution and how kind of Palestinian solidarity.
Why would Pan-Arabism be more amenable to socialist revolution?
Well, I mean, I'm drawing kind of an analogy to
If an empire is.
if an empire,
it would still just be Arab states.
yeah. But my point was like, I don't agree with that. The idea that like an empire is necessarily easier for revolution. So if that is, why wouldn't Pan-Arabism is kind of my point.
I guess because it would just be discrete states. It would be like the EU.
Okay.
I mean,
It's not like
there was an attempt to make it all.
Yeah.
Right,
massive,
but it would be like hypothetically be a preferable alternative to like, I think the term is like comprador bourgeoisie, have a national bourgeoisie compared to a comprador bourgeoisie that would be installed by the empire. So if you just do a comparison theory, one scenario of, of like a EU, but for the Arab world would be on paper more preferable compared to, empire.
I don't want Sal's point to get lost in details though, because I think there's a fundamental question of, well, let's say because there have been calls for like a what is it called, Socialist Federation of Middle Eastern States, right? This is something that socialist parties have called for, and now it doesn't seem feasible. But wouldn't something like that serve a similar purpose to the old empire? I'm trying to pose this as a genuine question.
What do you mean by like, sir?
Wouldn't that serve the same kind of
Function.
function as, from a revolutionary Marxist perspective?
Yeah, I guess I was kind of asking you to talk about that more, Luke, about like how exactly is the empire more ripe for revolution? And does it make sense to think of Pan-Arabism in a similar way?
So I think Pan-Arabism doesn't have the possibilities that a socialist federation of these states would, because the socialist federation of states isn't, it doesn't come along with the kind of method of revolution is bound up in our identity, a shared identity along, is Arab an ethnic or racial distinction? I don't know.
It's the language.
So like,
Yeah, what is it? I don't know.
The language, but it unites disparate people.
Right, but it's definitely different
it's an
than,
identitarian distinction.
than a movement based on
It's ethno-national.
class. Right, or, and not class taken in the socioeconomic way, but a category that could be traced back to the fundamental contradiction of capitalism.
This is a fun, like a kind of note that I'm kind of recalling, and I believe a letter between Marx and Engels. I believe Marx speculated that the Ottomans could be considered the most progressive empire at the time he was living in, arguing that it allowed more ethnic groups to be given room to breathe as compared to the English, French, Hungarian, Russian, etc.
To push the provocative point, though, what potential is there in the periphery? Let's just say that there is the developing world, the periphery, for revolutionary action, for revolutionary politics, even if it succeeds in overthrowing its government. Doesn't Marxism kind of focus on the core? You have to have some kind of concentration, worldwide, world significant concentration of capital for the revolution to actually make a difference, right? Like, who cares if we have a community that's quote unquote doing socialism? You need to have a worldwide proletariat, dictatorship of the proletariat.
I think that's a really good point you make, but I think that if we understand it in terms of like how production works on a global scale now, the Middle East is an incredibly important like trading hub, right? Like that federation would probably control the Suez Canal. That federation would probably control a good majority of oil production. So I think that there would be a lot of value there, right? So that's kind of the point I'm making, is that like, if there's going to be potential in the imperial core, like who's to say that like the oil production in that hypothetical federation wouldn't also have similar potential?
On a very basic level, if the revolution kicks off in one of these core peripheral areas, it's going to be crushed immediately. If it kicks off in only the United States, even then you'll have capital flight, or you'll have the rest of the world, have some type of entente attack it, right? So it has to be, and it would necessarily be like a global crisis if there were really revolution being kicked off. And you would have, in order for that to get there, you would have the building up of socialist parties in all of these places. The question is, as like a target, as a goal, if we're all organizing worldwide for this purpose, isn't it better to have like real communication and people living between this kind of metropole and periphery thing, so that all the revolutionary energy can, when something does kick off in whatever smaller country, it's directly tied to the organized socialist party in the core of capital.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at before, about like the need for international dual power and the lack of that sort of creating, I don't know, despair or like a turning away almost from that.
What's international dual power?
Just like something that could cross borders, that could be supportive of a revolution over here, right, from over there, that could combat the capital.
Like a party, do you mean? Or do you mean
Some kind of
else?
structure. Yeah, call it party, call it whatever you want.
Okay.
But
Could you say your name or?
Oh,
I mean,
my bad. I'm Danny. Nice to meet you.
Danny. Oh, right.
So I'm kind of just wondering about this. So as you mentioned earlier, like the Arab Peninsula was like super strategic and super important for everyone, like not just for oil, but also in geopolitics. But it's like, how could you even do a revolution over there when so many other foreign powers, like they're completely like, hell, like even China depends on the Arab world, like everyone is. And it's like, if they were to do a revolution, like literally the whole world would try to stop them because it goes against their, like, as you mentioned earlier, like if the Suez Canal gets controlled, like literal war was fought over it, like it would happen again.
So in that case, it might make sense to have this politics of like revolutionary defeatism, defensism, turn an international war into a civil war, right? Then maybe those concepts would have purchase. I mean, I think Marxism has dealt with questions at that level, but they did so 100 years ago. And now we've like lost sight of the historical context necessary to even think about those problems. Maybe we can transport ourselves back and like stave off the bad leftism of now and like really think about those. But I think it would take a lot of effort.
I guess just to synthesize it, but it's like, what would the incentive be for like the people in Arab countries? Like, I mean, like, I'm just gonna throw out Saudi Arabia, for example. I mean, I know we're not talking about them, but like, there are people like they enjoy a lot of the privileges that the oil industry gives them. Like, I mean, they get like most of their stuff paid for by that. Like, they enjoy like no property tax, but they're not property income tax because of that. So it's like,
Yeah.
why would they willingly pick a system like that?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be them. A revolution would be against them. It would be the millions of Southeast Asian workers that actually produce Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia. They would be the ones making the revolution. But I think it's more difficult when there are these split up nation states. And that's part of the point about, you know, despite being more globalized in a certain sense, as Sigmund was talking about earlier, Luke is drawing out how this, you know, post-colonial world is actually much more fragmented. And so I guess the big like elephant in the room that's sort of come up is the political party, and specifically the international socialist parties, because it's not like the difference 100 years ago was you just had smarter individuals like Karl Kautsky or Rosa Luxemburg. It was that they were spokespeople for an international movement that was itself possible because there were these massive capitalist empires bringing Polish people like Rosa Luxemburg into Germany, bringing people from Russia to America, all across the world. And a lot of that produced the actual crisis of imperialism, that socialist buildup of an actual threat to capitalism. And so it's absent of all that, that is the context that we're speaking about. It's not just, it's the ideas, but the ideas are a product in many ways or a conduit of the absence of socialist organization, leftist organization per se.
Wait, so Luke, actually I want to like continue on, like, so you believe that if there's like a socialist revolution going to happen, to make it really happen globally, that become a real revolution, you have happen in the center of the industrial, happen in the industrial center of the world, like United States.
Yeah.
You agree with that?
Yeah.
But like in the Russian Revolution and actually also in China, like the revolution, like at that time, Russia and China were not the center of the global system. They are the age country in the world. And still the revolution, like socialist revolution happened here. And even more, like take China, for example, the socialist revolution actually happened starting from the countryside. There's like this, they start with the countryside and they surrender urban place, and then they reach the social revolution. So how will we respond to that?
Second point first, within like how to do the revolution within the national context. So like the rural urban situation is different than like a core peripheral question, but even more so, do you recall the phrase from the reading group that Russia, I don't know if it's Trotsky who says, he calls Russia the weakest link in global capitalism, right? So it's still part of the core, it's just the weakest link. And that's because of all of the investment that's been dumped into Russia, which has, you know, increased proletarianization, et cetera, all these things, right? So, but yeah, it's not it's not Germany, it's not the United States at that time, or England, right?
And it failed. We're living in capitalism.
They were immediately attacked by all of the you know, the countries in which the revolution failed or never was attempted. So, I mean, to get to China, like, sure, we nominally have a communist government there, and we don't have to get into like how exactly we want to define
That's true.
the bona fides of the CCP, but it's not like able to create global dictatorship. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think one thing this makes me think of, and you know, tied to this whole idea of aggression in the left, is that we asked these questions to you about the potentials of world revolution. Like, would it be more possible if we had a pan-Arab conglomeration, or if it's a diverse amount of states, or you know, would it happen in the periphery of the core? And I guess the question to pose is that we put all these examples of what the left has said, and why haven't they asked these questions? I mean, there's no solution, I don't think you have that yet, I think that's the kind of thing that you're getting at, but.
It would be self-critical. I mean, they would have to be self-critical in order to pose these questions. And hopefully that would mean stepping back from just like blindly repeating previous generations' quote-unquote attempts at dealing with these problems.
No, so like on that point, I actually like fully agree with you that I think, I mean, for the Israel and the Palestine, I think they both experiment both like the liberalism and both the communism influence on them, but still the blood, the war between them never end. I think it's like war on the reality, like in a Lacanian way that all our symbol have all our like the symbol of ours cannot explain their reality. They just like fell into the most pure form of revenge between blood and blood.
Okay.
But I think the point there is that not just these two states, like the states, these two groups, Israel and Palestine, are in like this, I don't know, revenge, whatever, but you know, it sort of seems like the left is too, right?
Well, the thing is that if like I am the leftist and I come to Israel and Palestine and express my left idea to them, I'm not going to convince them just to suddenly become two peaceful country and just unite together. I don't think this is going to happen. So I think our war is useless for them. Like we are effortless talking about them, but like they wouldn't listen to us. And I think they don't listen to us because they are experiencing a different reality. Well, it's not a different reality. They are experiencing the true reality building, like the most barbarian form of reality that we, as the people that live actually in a much more peaceful world, never experiment.
Well,
I would totally disagree with that, by the way. This is an anti-colonial movement, all anti-colonial, what is it? It's not pharmaceutical, it's messy. Like all anti-colonial movements are. I mean, what the Palestinians are going through, I mean, we're getting ready to do Thanksgiving. Like, we have some stories like this in our past too. I don't, if you're colonizing people, Southern colonialism, let alone a post-colonial world as Israel was built. I mean, unfortunately.
Only for Thanksgiving that they were doing.
I totally agree that it's a lot of ways that we talk about it as unique actually covers up how it's one example of many of, I guess, getting to Luke's presentation, the horrors of the post-colonial world that we live in and the kind of tribalism that characterizes much of that process and ethnic cleansing, etc. But I guess the other thing I want to bring up with Sigmund's point is like, sure, that's not happening. We don't live in a place right now in the world where it's amenable for just sort of going and starting a socialist movement in Israel, Palestine. But the question is, well, what is the left doing? What are countries like the US doing? And it is doing something. People are holding up a certain mirror that is actually, I would say, exacerbating the kind of, I guess, sort of miserable, moralistic description that you were getting out of this bloodbath, and even the idea of revenge of races, revenge of religions, which I don't think is actually, like, that is actually a way of not thinking about the historical political reality of how this process came about. It's not just some millennial Christian Arab struggle that's going to last for all time. That's a way of not thinking politically. And so when the left just goes down the street and like sort of sensationalizes the horror, it is kind of like, you know, there are people in Israel, Palestine that are seeing that reaction from the world, and it's just building up. It's reinforcing a certain idea of, oh, this is just race versus race, endless horror. I don't think it's helping, or at least it does have a certain effect. What the left does or doesn't do.
And on that comment of the perennial conflict thing, I was like, I think a day ago, I was like listening to an interview former President Trump had on Univision, and he pretty much made like a similar point, the thing like, oh, there's no hatred like hatred of Israel, Palestine, it'll last on forever. So it's interesting how like even, you know, this ex-statesman will come to like a similar conclusion, like throw his hands up. So that was just fascinating to see him of all people bring it up.
Yeah.
Kind of just going off that, like I talked to one of my boys, or one of my buddies who's, he's Israeli. And
Wouldn't keep him that way.
he really has like a very deep, he's a lefty guy and all, but like he really believes in the state of Israel. He thinks that it's necessary for Jews, especially considering like what happened in World War II with like 50% of them dying. And it's like, it's very, and he really drove it home to me because it's like, how are you going to tell like a woman who's been living in Israel for like 50 years, like, go back to your country, like what the hell is my country? Like, so it's on both sides. Like you can't even tell like the Palestinians like you can't have your home back even though you lived there like 75 years ago. It's like it's very hard to come up with a way to have both people happy and even guarantee a way where both
Oh,
people
there
can.
is a way. There is a way.
What is
The
it?
What's the
problem-
way?
Israel has to choose. It can be a democracy and not be majority Jewish, or it can be majority Jewish and not.
Wait, real quick. Do you believe in generational trauma?
Yes.
So I mean, like, just think about it like a little on like an empathetic stance. I mean, like,
No, I'm
Jews,
not
come on,
saying
man.
anybody needs to go back. I was definitely.
But like, how can we
I'm
guarantee
saying
that
the
both people can live in
Palestinians like
peace?
proportionally support just having a state where all the Jews stay and they stay. The problem is that wouldn't be majority Jewish.
Also, to be fair, no one asked this question when, slavery ended, segregation ended, or the colonies ended. No one asked, oh, what will we do, afterwards? How do we secure this? No, they kind of like,
We've evolved as a society. Now we're asking these questions.
I know, I'm just
There's
saying.
a precedence for this in Liberia.
And like, because like of the stuff that you mentioned earlier, now we have like all these like messy ass situations. Like we're still talking about slavery, still feeling the effects of it hundreds of years later because we didn't ask these
Right,
questions.
I'm just
So
saying,
it's
like back then, like the
I
morality.
think we did ask these questions.
Kind of, but the morality,
was-
like the morality, like the sort of, the momentum of morality, like created this vortex where you couldn't really like, question the plausibility, feasibility, or, downward effects. Because if you talk about the morality of slavery in a Christian context, then it becomes all consuming. And
Yeah, but the opposition to slavery wasn't only Christian.
it was mostly Christian, at the
Adam
time.
Smith,
mostly
okay.
I guess I just want to give.
Alex had his hand up.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
yeah, I was just gonna say, you're right that a lot, like, well, maybe most, I'm not sure, but a lot of people in Israel just genuinely are completely convinced that as soon as they opt for something like a one-state solution, that all of the Arabs from all directions will descend in and just do a genocide like instantaneously. Like my mom believes that, I'm Jewish. She's completely convinced on that when I was being concerned right now. It's pretty widespread, but the thing is, like, I do think that, I don't know how feasible it is, but, people's minds do change over time if you do things like, if there's international pressure, if there's sanctioning pressure on them, then eventually that economic pressure does lead to a changing of opinions on that matter. I mean, there's, I think that's kind of, that happened in South Africa. It's just really, I mean, a lot of it is generational trauma, but a lot of it is also just accumulated paranoia of the oppressor projecting, that violence onto the oppressed,
Right.
saying if the slaves will kill me the second I let them be,
I heard of
et cetera.
Well, Will was gonna say
Oh,
something.
you got it, Madam.
I mean, that kind of raises the question though, does that have anything to do with the left? Does that have anything to do with socialism?
Well, it was like, if you want to be like, maybe big laws, but you could like rope in, the international abolition struggle with the left. If you want to do that.
Can I talk about the Jewish left?
Well, I was just gonna say something, which is that, I mean, I find it interesting, this comment about sort of drawing attention to the need for an Israeli solution, or it's some kind of movement within Israel as a solution and as a potentially leftist solution, a potentially emancipatory solution to the problem. But what that strikes me as is, I don't see the left thinking or talking about that at all, especially recently. Everything is surrounding what happened recently and the question of justifying Hamas's actions as a potentially a route of, destroying the Israeli state or at least weakening the army. And that might be a way. So there is a way that the left is thinking about, and this isn't everyone, of course, but is seeing the attacks by Hamas as potentially good. And like, that's the reality that I see on the left, is finding ways to justify and treat this attack as, okay, how could this open new roads? Rather than actually thinking about, what it would mean to have a social movement in the broader Israeli civil society or something. So just to point out that there's a big gap there, I think.
Granted, as opposed to reaching into Israel towards potential left movements there, I guess.
Your name so I can,
My name's Anne.
yeah, and you were gonna say something?
Oh, I've just been out with, not just Jewish White People, but with a bunch of other groups, and, I would always ask about the Jewish left over the years, and people would be like, oh, it's tiny, ignore it, it's nothing, they have no power. And, something about what just happened, it turns out there were a bunch of American Jews who were very leftist, very involved in various ways on like a really like left level on things. And but they just didn't want to mess with it, Israel. And this has mobilized them. They've been sitting on the fence about Israel, not saying anything, and they've jumped off the fence and they've jumped on the anti-Zionist side. So you're seeing all these protests that are being led by Jews. This is a newly large. I mean, Jewish West Boston grew like by 5 times in size in the last couple months. And these people it's not just Jewish Race for Peace. These people are involved in climate justice, other racial justice, gender justice, worker justice. The first protest I went to was co-sponsored by Jewish Race for Peace and a Jewish worker association that has existed in Boston since the 19th century. I was like, I had no idea. like the Jew, and you see it, I mean, in terms of global left that you've been seeing doing movements, the leftist Jewish side of things being pro-Palestine and ceasefire and anti-Zionist and trying to normalize anti-Zionism. They're doing a global thing. It's not the revolution. If you would have told me this was going to be the thing that the left galvanized around, I was like, there's no way. But
I'll push the mic back over to the side, but can I just take an opportunity to make a comment too? Which is, I wanted to get back to Sigmund's kind of situation where what do you do in the face of just blood feud?
I think that just buff you.
Something that has no social emancipatory potential. Like, how do you orient towards that? I think that you would, if you were trying to build a socialist party, you would try to do something like what these headlines are saying. You would appeal to, Palestinians and Israelis as workers, or you would appeal to people on the basis of something that you feel can revitalize, the socialist movement throughout the world. So are we really all that better than, I kind of feel bad that I might have had like a smirk on my face when I was reading these headlines because I don't have any better ideas in the end, right? And we would, why do we have to be part of, to pick up Silas's question, why do we have to be part of an empire in order to take responsibility for what's happening in the world? Wouldn't that still just start at home? We're all in America, so why don't we try to do that? Which seems like an atypical question for a Platypus member to say, right? But the flip side of that is all of the activity and the positive, seeing like a revitalization of the left around this issue, seeing that as progress, or seeing an opportunity, with the October 7th, as grim as that prospect is, that's somehow different from what's maybe possible, or what seems in light of what the historic left did. It seems like there's an act of forgetting and preventing the learning of lessons by repeating all of these forms of like leftism, kind of as a routine response to, oh, Israel, Palestine popped up again. Let's get out the old whatever flags or something. But yeah.
Yeah, the most salient example is, the anti-Iraq war protest where, millions formed this great answer, like the IMP thing. And then like at the end of the day, really didn't do much South, America, England, and other, European countries' entry into that war. And then stuff, troop surge, and then stuff, the eventual sectarian conflict that, sprung out from it. Even in like millions across the planet marching against it and, lobbying Congress to party with it.
And it didn't start a revitalization of this work left.
Wait, so
I want to hear from Danny, but okay, you can go first.
no, I was just going to say more about your empire thing, because is that the Zionism and Israel colonialism of Palestine actually a spread, actually like is like extension of America's imperialism over the Middle East. So for that logic, that Palestine is actually in this like the global empire of the United States, of like this imperialism, that the imperialism of the United States actually caused this thing in the Middle East. So they are actually part of the empire.
Well, is
But
it
not the
useful to
sense
use the
that-
term imperialism and thinking of the United States as an empire in a world without any movement for socialism?
I also just would disagree with the characterization of Zionism and the Israel state. It's not just a historical product of an American imperialist agenda. It's just, that's just not what it's talking about.
American imperialists actually helped the growth of Israel inside.
No doubt in the last several decades, but it's not how Zionism started.
Like I
or-
pointed out, Stalin was like the first guy to recognize it. And then even like at the end there, like some of the Zionist militias took some pretty hardline stance against the British, bombing the King David Hotel, lynching British officers to accelerate their independence. So.
But Zionism and trying to establish imperial states starts like World War I.
Right,
before that, yeah.
Zionism and
Right, I'm just pointing out, they have,
predates all of that.
I'm just pointing out that they have a complicated relationship with empire, in some cases collaborating with the British, in other cases revolting against the British. And then for a few decades relying on the Soviet Union, few decades afterwards becoming more related to the United States, but then slowly over time being able to like promote their imperial goals, even more so over basic American interests. Because if America, like there's a lot of geopolitical goals.
Let's not go too much into geo. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I appreciate
I mean, at the end of the day, Israel's not a colony of America because America can't make Israel do a ceasefire.
Yeah. And Israel has been collaborating with China, so they always have like someone else to jump to.
I did want to get back to Danny's question.
So, two really quick things. Open question, is there any way that we could maybe view the relationship of like Hamas and Israel to like maybe transition to something maybe closer to like IRA to England at some point in the future? And I guess the second one would be, I heard a very interesting redneckism from my friend the other day, and it was like, it was so simple, and honestly, I couldn't reply to anything. So I mean, I hope you guys could come up with something, but he said an ideal one-state solution for him would be to have international observers or like the UN peacekeepers to just stay there for like the next 100 years to make sure that nothing goes wrong. But it's like, I honestly couldn't say anything about that. So I mean, like with
like right during the first periods of decolonization, the United Nations filled in this role. I think it's called the UN trusteeship, in which the UN basically would like temporarily like oversee newly freed colonies like in I think Ghana and Liberia for like a few years, and then put on a trajectory towards full independence. So yeah, possibly like UN trusteeship in like some.
Well, don't we have any criticisms of the UN? Don't
Yeah, it feels like that's all.
the UN's not available.
How worse does it get? Like I could
Perspective.
like I could
Also, Israel's been killing them too. They would kill first.
right, but we could
Oops.
force them not to.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to just the complete inadequacy of like the supposedly international government structures that exist.
But that's to be expected by leftists. The
Yeah.
question is, what are leftists going to do about it?
I know this moderation tactic never works, but would anyone who hasn't spoken yet like to say anything? We'll wait 15 whole seconds of uncomfortable silence. Back to this one.
I guess just to bring it back to the very basic question of why we have this, well, non-panel. But teach it in the first place of what does this actually, is there potential of this conflict or of Northern Ireland to England, or any other, conflict that the left might seize on? Does it actually push forward socialism?
Or could it?
Could it? Yeah, what is the potential here?
I guess just my brief thought is the only way I could see potential is if there was a left that could criticize the tactics of Hamas on the basis of historical socialist strategy. And the unfortunate reality is the only people criticizing Hamas are like Fox News, and the left is too demagogical to have, or institutionally bereft to have a critique, I think, that would self-consciously have an alternative and move forward beyond it.
What's clear alternative to Hamas is the institutional party of Fatah, which on paper is social democratic, but there's been, a lot of criticism from Palestinian activists on authority in the West Bank over, its censoring certain of its critics and collaborating with Israeli security demands and failing to provide certain social services. So best case scenario would be, Palestinian authority absorbing Gaza and then renewed calls for reform within Fatah to better serve Palestinian people would be a decent option on paper.
To answer Angela's question directly, this is a failed panel, and it's a failure on the basis of we failed to have a conversation about a topic that is like pertinent on the left. Everyone's talking about it, but somehow we can't. And I think that speaks to the, hesitancy of people to be criticized in, non-comradely ways, but also there seems to be nothing productive to say about it. And that seems to be true of almost all the panels that Platypus is trying to hold. People have to be coaxed into positions that, so it's such that they remember what they used to say, rather than them coming out and saying it, not even to mention saying it to other leftists who might not quite agree yet. And I don't think this is an adequate response to the IRA question, but there might have been a small difference if the IRA thought that other Irish people who were their political enemies, they saw them as kind of incorrect, to be educated, to be convinced, whereas now there's not really there's more of a, it seems an opportunity to denounce rather than to convince. And I don't want to paint the IRA in like too great of a light on this count, but I think there was a small difference there, just in terms of political enemies in general.
I want to say something really small.
Yeah.
I feel like when I'm looking at Israel-Palestine, what I'm looking at is like we've reached the limits of the nation state system. It's always been problematic. It's always produced violence. It's always been a problem, and here we have raised the limits. And what's the alternative? What's the alternative? And I mean, this is the alternative. I mean, I don't know if we're going to get to the alternative, but there's no two-state solution here. I don't care what people say. And there's no two-state solution. So, but I think it's a commentary on the failure of the nation-state system as a whole. And it needs to be replaced. For the very survival of the humanity, it needs to be replaced.
In politics, it needs to.
And the left is the only people that are talking about replacing it with something that could be viable.
We're talking about Israel and Palestine in general, or in general, about the reaching the limit of national state system.
Well, I think it's highlighting all the problems with the nation state that are ongoing, right?
Yeah.
This isn't even the only genocide going on right now.
Right, but it's like,
The nation state system produces genocide. It's a feature, it's not a bug, It's just created all kinds of problems all down the line, and it needs to be replaced. What?
But I guess the provocative point that was, I think, implied by Luke was that it was precisely the post-colonial leftist supported, leftist champion post-colonial struggle that actually, entrenched this condition, this sort of half-conscious affirmation of the nation state, of national self-determination as an end in itself. It was the left that ideologically and materially performed that. And so I think that's partly what this sort of platypus thesis of the regression of the left, that's one kind of particular clear manifestation. And I don't have an answer other than to say, well, we need to confront that.
I want to sneak in one more point. When Israel and Palestine are popping off, not to be glib, but this is our opportunity to like think as the left, right? When the crisis of the nation state confronts us, it's also the moment where we refuse to think as the left, where we return to these old sloganeering, these old slogans and the which side are you onism and all of that stuff. That's what we kind of remember from the last protest movement. What if we just think, we're failing every day, even when Israel and Palestine aren't in the news. We're failing to prevent the barbarism that's happening, the other genocides that are going on, and the future ones that will inevitably happen. World War III that will inevitably happen someday. We're failing to make good on the deaths and the wasted potential of all of humanity, right? Everyone's life is wasted, and in more or less horrific ways. Some people are wasted pleasurably, but they're all wasted in light of our historical task. So why can't we, outside of this, calls to protest, why can't we do the work anyway? And I don't mean do the work as in repeat the work. I mean, like, take the task as an unfortunate turn of phrase. Why don't we take up the task in general? What stops, other than these ideological taboos, what stops us from forming a socialist party, from being able to meaningfully change the world as the left once thought it could?
Maybe on that provocative point, unless there's some less comments, we were talking about grabbing a drink somewhere. Unless I don't want to prematurely close off. That was just an eloquent way of.
Yeah, thank you all for coming first.
Okay.
I really appreciate it.
All right, let's give Luke a round.
Yeah, I'll be going to have this drink at, what is it called?
I think Barrymore and Newton Center. It's like a mile or so away.
For our travel.